everybody. My name is Vixie Bell. I'm your friendly neighborhood GM and player here at the Pocket Dragon Pub. And today we are doing an episode of Weal or Woe, our TTRPG Review Show. On this show, we talk about different TTRPGs that exist in the world, aside from the world's greatest role-playing game, and its closest competitor, which aren't, anyway, they aren't very close at all, but you know, I digress. Moving on. Today I am joined by my fabulous guest, Barkeeps. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves and tell our beautiful viewers a little bit about you?
Sure. My name is Katelyn. Katelyn Summers. You can find me at heykatelyn.com. I'm a graphic designer and I work in the tabletop industry. I've been playing D&D since I was 13 years old.
Same. Actually, fancy enough. Hello, everyone. My name is Winter. I don't use social media at all, but you can find me and my friends' work at cyberneticcoven.com. We are an international artist collective that has a deep interest in tabletop role-playing games in addition to all other manners of artistic endeavors. And like I said before, I've also been playing D&D since I was about 13. But since then, I have branched out and have played a lot more other different, better games.
different hashtag better, but games. Anyway, everyone who plays D&D is out there shaking fists.
You can love D&D and also recognize the faults.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, just because we like it doesn't make it not problematic. Anyways. Sorry about that. My cat was there.
But just because it's problematic, it doesn't mean you can't have fun with it.
Absolutely. So that said, let's take a look at some of the TTRPGs that we're talking about today. So we're going to be talking about 3 different games in the fantasy genre. That's why this is Weal or Woe Fantasy. Yeah, I know, sparkly rainbows and glitter and all that stuff. Anyway, yeah. So the 3 games that we'll be reviewing today are Icon, 13th Age, and Cairn. We're gonna grade each game on several different categories. The first of which is the game itself, the narrative, the premise behind the narrative, and the world. And the other thing we'll be looking at are the mechanics, how easy they are to learn and to use for both player and GM. I also want to make sure that we are all aware that these are our personal opinions about these games. It does not mean that they are bad games, and it does not mean that you should not try them. Please try them. We want you to try as many games as possible. There are so many different wonderful games to play in the TTRPG space. This is just a small sample. So yeah, don't come at us in the comments just because we said something about your game that you don't like. We promise. I'm sure like there are people out there that have different perspectives, that maybe don't see the same things that we do, or maybe see things differently than we do. We're totally open to that. Again, this is just our personal opinions and the things and games that we are the most interested in playing. That giant disclaimer out of the way, let's get to the meat of the discussion. Let's talk about our first game. I think let's go ahead and start with Icon. Having discussed this off screen a little bit earlier, we just talked about Icon as being a JRPG, and I think, Katelyn, you mentioned that this game was by a comic book artist.
Yes.
Is that right?
I believe Tom Bloom is the author of Kill 6 Billion Demons.
Yeah, Tom Bloom also goes by Abaddon.
Yes, that's the screen name they use. And this game, I feel like, has a lot of the same DNA as the comic book series, which is why I was really excited to get into it. Mm-hmm. It is like heavy on the like lore, feels old, and everything in the world feels lived in. And every character is like so nailed down to their like tiniest degree of uniqueness, which I think is really cool. But yeah, it's a big one though. It is a big chonker of a game.
Yeah, I noticed the book is 500 pages long. So if you're going to check this game out, either in PDF or hardcover, know that it is a thick little volume. Yeah, you've got bullet
Do
points.
it. Do the bullet points.
All right. So that said about Icon, there's just some fun facts there about the game itself. The art for me is really pretty. I love that kind of anime feel that the art has. But let's talk about the criteria. Let's talk about the game, the narrative premise, and the world. What did you guys think of Icon's world and narrative premise?
So Icon's world and narrative premise, on the whole, it is not, I would not say it is the most unique premise. However, it is a far cry from traditional fantasy fare. It posits that the world is very old. There's this ancient civilization that existed, and it posits adventurers not as the traditional Tomb Raider conquistador adventurer type, going in places, stealing people's stuff, but more as people in the world trying to survive and going into these ruins of this long dead civilization, of which no one can really lay claim to, as it is so far in the past and was effectively global, and are taking this technology and these resources in order to make the world and the survivors of this world strictly better. It actually has a relatively almost post-apocalyptic feel, in the sense of there aren't big kingdoms, there aren't big nations. It is really these games and stories about smaller communities and smaller groups of people surviving and living in this world.
I kind of get some Castle in the Sky vibes from that. If you're familiar with the Ghibli film Castle in the Sky, it's a similar premise where there's essentially, but a little bit different in the sense that the ancient ruins weren't necessarily globalized. There were people trying to take advantage of them. But spoilers if you haven't seen it, sorry. But yeah, it's a little bit of that vibe where you have that sort of situation happening, which is very cool. And Katelyn, how did you feel about the narrative and the premise kind of involved in Icon?
I really agree with what Winter said about it's just this kind of pre-lived-in world, post-apocalyptic feeling, which isn't unique in itself, but it's unique in the way that they flavored it. Just with the way it's a lot of traveling bands of caravans and traders, and there's different factions you can get tied into. This concept that the world ended and then survived, and then now it seems like the world is going back into the kind of a dark age. They call it the churning age of there's a lot of people pushing for kind of a harsher world, more of a combative world, whereas there's a lot of people that also push for we live in a very pastoral world. We're in one with nature. We are a people that share with others, and there's kind of this torn feeling. But a lot of the time you are probably going to be playing a character who is on quests to go delve these ancient ruins and find things to help people or to gain more power or whatever means to an end. And I really like that as a setting because it makes it feel I feel like you don't have to imagine too hard to put yourself in that world. It's very easy to be oh, cool, okay, ancient world, got it. Everything's old, perfect.
Everything is ancient here. Yeah, it does sound like a very cool premise in the sense of the environment that you're surrounded by. And it seems like the narrative is simple enough that you can pull stories out of that as well. Because you have the different factions, you can pull narratives out of that. As a very narrative-driven DM, I love that. I love having little tidbits to kind of build off of as well. So that's very cool. I think, is there anything else about this game's narrative and maybe the world that really caught your eye and makes it kind of unique as opposed to other TTRPGs?
I think the way that they do races, which in this are called kin, and then they also do they're called your culture. I really like the way that they introduce the concept of kin and culture and how those are two separate identities. And in the world, it's because it's just kind of been a very globalized world in the sense of you can be a rabbit person living in a village with mostly, I think they're called Thrin, or humans essentially. And it's a very diverse culture, and you focus more on what your family or you do rather than what's your race, which is I feel where a lot of the stumbling blocks in a lot of traditional fantasy RPGs, that's where they hit.
Right, especially in today's day and age where that has to be handled with a lot of sensitivity as well. Just by virtue of what we know now versus what we knew back then.
Yes.
You know?
The game does a really good job at subverting a lot of traditional fantasy game tropes, like the fact that you pick your kin and it determines like what you look like and what you are, but it has no actual bearing on what your capabilities and abilities are within the game. So you could be a big buff demon person, but that doesn't mean that you have a super high strength or a low charisma or anything. You can look like anything, and everyone is equally capable of anything within the game.
Yeah, you get most of your skills through like the jobs you do,
right.
which kind of goes into like your backstory, and it lets you build your character in that kind of way.
Very cool. Okay, yeah, see, I like that too, because it seems more organic than traditional fantasy games, where you sort of kind of start off wealthy and kind of omnipotent, as it were. I've had that conversation before, where you're basically like in D&D, where you're basically all trust fund kids that have decided to go on an adventure. Because like what you get in gold is like 3 pieces of gold is a year's salary for some of these people, these NPCs that you meet, and you're just like, I got 100 gold, But anyway, so that aside, Icon sounds like a very fun game to play. But as far as the premise and the narrative, it sounds super interesting. But let's talk about mechanics. Let's start with character building. How do we feel about building characters within this world?
It's a lot. You need to know a lot about what you want to do going into it, and then you also need to know it just kind of, if anything, it felt like in a lot of RPGs where you have a character type where you need to make like 20 different decisions before you even play the character. Which is fine if you go into things knowing like I want to be this savant of the dancer or whatever, then great, you've got your character. Like going into this, I tried to go into a lot of these games just like I'm going in blind, and whatever the world inspires me to make is what I make. And this one, it was a lot of reading. It's heavy.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of reading involved in making a character. I wonder, I should look and see if there's an online character gen for this, because that's usually how I game the system with longer form games.
You say that in the book itself, the writer, Tom Bloom, says like, there's no character sheets for this game, but I don't know, somebody will probably make them. And I did end up finding somebody who made like form fillable character sheets.
That's terrifying. It's like, good luck.
Yeah, I don't know. Good luck.
Ooh, okay. Winter, what do you think of character creation?
So the real big thing about character creation is I feel when you make your character, you're not just really making a single character, you're really making multiple characters because of how the game divides its gameplay loop. So you have narrative mechanics and narrative play where the rules are very streamlined, very focused, very almost, I don't want to say powered by the apocalypse, but very much more focused on, you want to do something, you want to like do something athletic. Okay, roll your athletic skill. Okay, how many successes did you get? Okay, you do the thing. You don't need to narrate out the nitty gritty of resource management, attack rolls. You just kind of do it. But then it also has a very in-depth, very crunchy tactical system, which is removed from the narrative system. So you might have decisions that you make for your narrative play, where like your ex-kin, you're a traveling trader type of character. That means you have these abilities. Right. But then you're also an adventurous hero. So your tactical combat stats are a completely separate pool of abilities with different mechanics. It actually takes a lot of homage from D&D 4th edition, where you kind of have a main job, but then within that job, you have different types of way to play that job.
Gotcha. Okay.
And every single one of them has their own abilities you can take, and you can also mix and match abilities between them. And then you can upgrade specific abilities within them. And it's a lot. Yeah.
It takes a lot from Blades in the Dark, if you've ever played that before.
Yes.
The tactical side also uses the countdown clock system, as well as like the effort and strain system of like, I'm going to push myself. Honestly, like a lot of the rule set just kind of felt like Blades in the Dark, a little more complicated than it needed to be.
Yeah.
I don't know. It it's tough because like I can see why they wanted to be so intricate with this system because of how the world is built, and it's an intricate world. And they also wanted to give a lot of options to players that maybe I don't want to play the tactical side, I just want to do the narrative side, so they have to fully flesh that out so that it can carry itself. Or I just want to do tactical, they have to flesh that out. It's as if there's 2 games in one.
It almost feels like it needs to be split into two volumes for those types of players. Like this game fused itself into one book when it really kind of needed to be 2 books for geared towards different types of players, you know, like maybe one is the narrative guide and one is the mechanical guide. But the other thing that I'm noticing too is I know Blades in the Dark has had a very heavy influence on a lot of the games we've brought on the show, and so is Powered by the Apocalypse. Those are both very popular. But I have noticed that in the games that kind of try to combine the two, things wind up more complicated than they need to be.
It's like muddled.
Yeah, it's a little muddled. I feel like they're great systems on their own, but trying to put them together might not be as successful as designers would like it to be. And maybe there needs to be a little more tweaking that goes into that. But that's just my opinion based on like, you know, what I'm hearing and what we've talked about on the show before. But yeah, and so that's character creation. Let's talk about mechanics from a GM standpoint. Do you guys find is it asymmetrical? Is it the GM handling like a lot of workload? How would this game feel for you if you were going to GM it?
So the GM side does have, there's not quite as many buttons to push as the player's side, but the system is rife with a lot of different tools for the GM to really tweak and really create the type of game that they want to have. So there are multiple different optional rules that you can implement within your game that modify how quests work and the times between resting and what resting does, and how combat functions and how enemies work. And the game gives you just a lot of stuff to work with and a lot of buttons and dials to hone in on the exact experience you want to tell.
Okay.
But I feel in play, it's a lot to juggle, but just because it's a lot to juggle does not mean that it is not without meaning or without worth. And
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was actually going to kind of go back to what you were saying earlier about how the game feels like it's muddled, or that it's or that there's too much going on. I actually kind of disagree with that in the sense that while there is a lot going on, everything about the game does feel like it is within conversation with itself. Okay. So that it gives you the option of you go from narrative and then narrative flows into tactical and then flows back into narrative. And if you don't want that flow, you don't have to use it, but it feels more like multiple parts that can stand on their own that come together to make something greater than the sum of them, rather than something like Daggerheart we discussed previously, where it's a bunch of visual stuff stuck together that are conflicting. I don't feel Icon is conflicting or fighting with itself.
That's fair.
Just a lot.
No,
and a lot of
that's
options.
Fair. It's a lot of upfront decisions.
Yes.
I think that's where I feel like it gets a little muddled, is like I feel like the onboarding could be a little more streamlined. Because I feel like that's the stopping block for most people getting into a game, is just how quickly can I sit down and start rolling dice.
Right.
Yeah, actually, and it's funny that you say that because I'm that player. Like, I'm that person when it comes to both GMing and playing. I like a very streamlined onboarding. I like to be able to build a world and build a character in a very quick and efficient manner so that I can get to the game as quickly as possible. So I think something as in-depth as Icon, given the appropriate amount of time, I would be more than willing to give it a shot. But because it requires that large, like that much dedication to the material, I don't know that I'd pick it up offhand unless someone requested it and said, hey, let's try this game.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say something I think that is cool from the DM's perspective is the way that they structure leveling up for characters. Is they structured in like the chapter structure. And I think this is a really nice way to kind of how a DM can visualize not all campaigns need to be like this, but kind of breaking it down to that 3-act structure that is used in pretty much every media all the time. And this makes it kind of simplified of like, these are the 3 levels that exist in chapter 1. These are the 3 levels that exist in chapter 2. These are the 3 levels that exist in chapter 3. So you know kind of what power levels you're dealing with when you get into it. I really like that. I think that's a nice structuring or tool.
Yeah, anything that clarifies stuff like that for the GM is I've always found those really helpful. So that is something that I liked about Daggerheart Q's, specifically with their monsters. It was it was a lot easier for me to understand that than CR, although people argue like, it's not that hard. And I'm like, look, this was a flashcard. The other thing needed a little more than that. But anyway, that sounds like a very interesting thing. If you were to GM this though, again, I know Winter, you feel like there's a lot to track on here. If you were to GM this, do you think you'd feel the same, Katelyn? Like, would it be a lot to track for your players?
I feel like for the players, the thing that would be a lot to track is just their character sheets and all the like different tick marks that they have to do. Like the character sheet is pretty substantial. There's a lot of like checking things and checking marks and stuff. As a DM, I feel like that's less so. I feel like it's a little bit more streamlined, more of a standard like fantasy RPG kind of setting. Or at least fantasy RPG experience in the sense of like I tell a story and then you tell me what happens in that story. The game definitely gives you a lot of tools that you can use, like, like pieces that you can put in, whether it's the factions or different types of monsters and how those different types of monsters play into the different like socioeconomic structure in this world. I think the world itself is enough of a playground that a DM could have a really good time.
Yeah, nice. So it's interesting because I know a lot of times the way that you're describing this, it reminds me of games that are actually skewed the opposite way, where the DM has a lot to track and has a lot to keep track of, and the bulk of the work is kind of falling on the GM. From what you're describing, it doesn't feel like it's the same in this game. Like it's maybe a little easier for the GM, and a lot of the onus is on the players to kind of really put together the narrative pieces of the story, at least. Would you say you feel the same, Winter?
Oh, absolutely. The game is written in such a way that it gives you a lot to play with, but it also gives you a lot of framework and kind of helps you understand how these things work together. So there's this kind of, I feel there's this mentality in a lot of TTRPG spaces where the more rules a game has, the harder it is to play and the less creativity you actually have. And I think this game rejects that notion in the sense of it gives you a lot of tools to play with, but they are treated as tools and are written as tools and guides and helping. So as the GM, you just pick the things you want to care about, and and you basically make your own workload. Do you want to have a really complicated game with lots of factions and stuff behind the scene and monster stats, et cetera, then you as a GM can do that. And because you're a GM that likes that, it's not going to be a problem for you. But if you're a GM that wants to just focus on, we're going to sit around, roll some dice, tell a cute, fun story, and not deal with battle maps and all of that, then you can play that too and have as much of a time.
It sounds like Icon is one of those games that can be very versatile. Obviously, Katelyn, based on some of your input, it sounds like it needs to be streamlined in certain areas, but for the most part, can be a really fun game. But that said, is there anything else you want to add about this game that maybe people should look into, or you think might interested you when you were reviewing it?
Yeah, not enough RPGs have bug people. Let me play with bugs. It has bug people, and I'm into it.
Amazing. We love bug people in this house.
So not so much something of interest, but a point of note that I think is worth considering is the writer also wrote a webcomic called Kill 6 Billion Demons, which pulls from a lot of Asian mythology and a lot of Eastern, like I said, Eastern mythology, Eastern culture, and has a lot of trappings of things like Hinduism, Buddhism, all kind of wrapped together into that. There's a good amount of that in here too, which also makes sense because it is a game that is very much written to be a love letter to JRPGs. It wears the fact that it is a Final Fantasy Tactics-inspired game on its sleeve to the point that players can't move diagonal in battle maps, just like that game.
No!
But along with that, I think you could look at this through a more critical lens, and you could read it as some of the things coming off as a bit Orientalist, as a bit, white dude writing about a culture that isn't his type of thing. I do think there's a conversation to be had, not so much as I think so and so is racist, but more of a something to think about the game, and it might be something that, if you're a person of the culture that this game is aping, kind of I don't know if I like that. So more of a word of caution and a word of something to think about, as opposed to a actual diversion.
Yeah, something I think that's important to note. It's probably worth discussing with your table. But I think the open communication is important at any table. If you want to try Icon to make sure that, hey, these are the themes that we're reviewing, if this is an issue for you, or if you're a member of this culture and you're not appreciative of the way in which it's portrayed in this game, we don't have to play it, so on and so forth. It's always important to bring it to your table and listen to their concerns about the game, and voice any that they might possibly have. So that said, I think it's time to give this game a rating. What are we thinking? Are we giving this a wheel, a woe? Are we a little mixed about it? What are we thinking?
I'm mixed, but I'm leaning towards woe. This is a personal thing. I don't love JRPGs, the outside of very specific ones. That being said, I'm a huge fan of the Persona series, so that's a contradiction in itself. But the amount of again, it's just the barrier of entry for new players, I feel would be a big stopping block for me. I think that in order for a game to be successful, players need to be able to understand it from the get-go. And a lot of that comes from just how you communicate your setting in your games. And I think that it could be really good. I just kind of wish it was streamlined in the beginning and then maybe stripped down of some of the less necessary bits.
That's fair. So that's a woe from Katelyn. Winter, what would you give it?
Oh, I would give it a wheel just because it hits so many of the things I like, because I like complicated games, and I like a lot of what the game is doing. I don't think it does everything perfectly. I do think Katelyn is correct in the sense that it definitely needs some pruning, it needs some cleaning, but all of its ideas excite me and are interesting. But it does need, I think, a bit more of a pass to really maybe find its focus. But
it's one of those things of I feel I run into this in a lot of fantasy RPGs of I would love to read a book in this setting. You wanted to write a book and then you decided to make an RPG instead.
Right.
And, I feel that this is so full, you can write a book in this setting.
Right.
Easily.
And just based on the discussion that we're having, like I said, I think that this would benefit from not just one book, but two, for the different kinds of players that they're trying to approach. They can be part of the same series so that you could own both books if you wanted to run either style of game. But having it separated out into narrative and mechanical kind of makes it more accessible for people who might want a rules light narrative game versus a rules full battle game, if you will. But that said, given that we have one wheel and one woe, I believe that's mixed results for this game. We like it. It's an interesting premise, but it does need some improvement. I think that what you were saying is correct. It does need a little bit of a second pass, maybe a little bit of streamlining before the game can really be something that people want to pick up and play based on just what we've discussed here. But again, as I said, if you want to give it a shot, go for it. See if you agree with us, or maybe you found a way to play it that is effective and does streamline it in a way that maybe we didn't think about. Let's move on to our second game. Our second game is Cairn. So let's talk a little bit about Cairn. And I believe we were talking about this as being a derivative of an older version of Dungeons and Dragons. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So,
I believe the literal game that it is a play off of is a game called Into the Odd, but that game itself is very much pulling from what's referred to as the old school Renaissance or the OSR style of design that pulls a lot from the classic, like classic AD&D traditional Dungeons and Dragons, very much like kind of the first games.
The first games that we talked. It was it's interesting too because there's other games that use Into the Odd mechanics. Mouse Ritter is one of them, and that's the only that's one of the reasons I'm familiar with the system. And I think that system is actually pretty fun because it kind of subverts the trope of having to roll a natural 20 all the time. Mm-hmm. You don't want to roll natural 20s; you actually want to roll low. Or else bad things happen. So I kind of like that about the system, but that's getting into mechanics. I think we're jumping a little bit ahead. Let's get into the game itself. How do you guys feel about the setting and the world of Cairn?
It is very bare bones. I will say that from the get-go, which I like, because that means that as a DM, you can come in and kind of apply what you want to it. That being said, the setting that you get out of the book itself is much like it's a dark and spooky, mysterious world. The woods are filled with danger and folklore, and you are like adventurers kind of going through this harsh world. It gives me a lot of like Dark Souls vibes of like everything's kind of dirty and old. And spooky.
It's old but scary. And the first thing I thought was the night is dark and full of terrors. So.
It's a lot of like horrible monstrosities are hiding in the bog, and you're going through the wood kind of thing.
Oh, geez. Okay, very cool.
That kind of aesthetic I love. Just like, it's spooky. What do you want?
Yes. And Winter, how do you feel about it?
I mean, that's absolutely correct. I would almost go one step further and almost say that there is no setting. There is a tone, and the tone is like trying to kind of lean into like almost survival horror, but not explicitly horrific. More just you're a normal person living in a very big world. Go. And while it does give you that type of tone and a vibe, it doesn't really do anything else. Like what kind of monsters? Well, I guess vague folklore, but it's like what like European folklore, Eastern folklore, African folklore. Like it doesn't give you anything to work with. It just kind of drops you into this concept. It's not a setting. It's less a narrative, and it's just a vibe.
Yeah, it sounds like it's just a vibe. Like, here's a general vibe of the game. Have at it. And as a GM, I have played a game like that. Only it was when I didn't realize that was what the game was like. There's a game called Cats of Cthulhu, and apparently, if you don't buy book 2, you have no setting. Just mechanics. So I had to pull a world out of my butt for the people that I was playing with, which I did. But Cairn sounds a little bit similar to that game in that sense, where it's like, here's an idea. Good luck. Yep. It's like, wait, what? Is there a tutorial?
It feels like the kind of campaign. It feels like the kind of game that would be really great for. I have an idea for something, but the traditional D&D and traditional like more popular like Paizo games are not fitting in this. I want something different. This feels like you can just like slap that on and it looks, oh, mamma mia.
Yeah, it's like, oh, look, great.
Right.
Perfect.
A lot of like modern fantasy games tend to lean more into the heroic fantasy side of things, where it's you are an exceptional individual, you're a hero, you're going off and doing these big epic things. And Cairn is just the opposite. And I don't know if it's a good word for not heroic. It's not anti-heroic fantasy, not heroic fantasy, more like mundane fantasy, where you're a peasant. You've got a hoe and a backpack and maybe some armor.
If you're lucky.
Have fun. Yeah, if you're lucky, go.
I do think from like a character kind of perspective of like how do you build a character if you have no setting, a lot of it's going to come from your DM, of course. This is a kind of game where the DM is going to come up and tell you their setting. But if as somebody who was just reading the book and was like, okay, I need to make a character, going into that was definitely a little challenging. But I think that the way the book does character creation made it very easy for me to be like get into the mindset of like this vibe.
Nice. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think that this is a good time to kind of get into the mechanics, especially because the joke here is there is no world, Neo. LOL. Right. But anyway, so going into mechanics, so building a character is easy despite the fact that there is no like world setting, just a general vibe. So that's good to know. Widger, do you think the same thing about character building?
So I would almost argue that there is no character creation. And what I mean by that is that it pulls, again, it's pulling from an older style of play. And in classic like advanced Dungeons and Dragons, you did not make a character, you rolled a character. That's where like the idea of rolling a character comes from. Because you did that. You did not sit there and pick, oh, I'm going to choose these stats and this armor and this class. It's you rolled it, wrote down what you rolled, and that's what you're playing. And over the course of the game, the gameplay and how you portray that character creates the character through play. I believe it's commonly referred to as it's more of an emergent storytelling. The game of Cairn is not about a character going on an adventure. It is about you, the player, playing this game and seeing what happens to this person you are portraying. Okay.
All right. Interesting, because it makes me think of games like Fall of Magic, which have a similar idea behind them, although they are played entirely differently than this game. But it's more about like here you're picking all these things, you don't necessarily roll in Fall of Magic, but you're just picking a bunch of traits, throwing them together, making a character, and then seeing what happens to this character throughout the course of the story, which I think is pretty interesting. But yeah, Okay. As far as so that's character creation. How do we feel about this from a GM standpoint, as if you were going to GM this game?
There's not a lot to work with. It is very bare bones. I think the book is exactly 24 pages. A sweet short to the point 24 pages.
As opposed to the game we just talked about, which is 500.
It feels like opposite. Like total opposite. They give you like, here are some spells and here's some monsters and like they give you like a quick reference sheet. This game feels like it's more built for players, and then the DM kind of works with what they're given from the player's standpoint. Like I understand that, I've got my strength, dex, and will. Okay, I can start working a adventure in that's going to utilize those kinds of checks. Or I'm going to have things that have like, how do I put this? I think the biggest thing about this game, like the boilerplate I put on this game, is that it's a game about your inventory. And so as a DM, I feel like working in chances for characters to use that inventory or get new inventory or have to deal with that inventory would be most of the game.
Okay, great. Interesting. So the GM is pretty much building all of this with almost nothing, which is stressful, to say the least. Winter, what do you think?
I mean, that's absolutely correct. The game doesn't give you really anything to work with. It doesn't give you even a lot of hard mechanics to do things with, because it is an extremely straightforward system of just roll under your stat. But it doesn't even have things like, how does poison work? How does fire work? How do these basic things you would expect to have rules for in a game don't work? So everything is on the GM to create the world wholly, but also you aren't even really given your players to bounce off of, because the players are just, cool, I rolled a bunch of traits in some inventory, let's go. So you don't even necessarily have things like, okay, well, we have like this type of plot arc or this type of, player A is playing a, paladin, so okay, I can play off of that. Or, player B as like a wizard with a dark past, okay, I can play off of that. You don't have anything. So it is just, okay, a random pool of people, we're in the woods now.
Go.
Go. It's the Hunger Games, only you don't even know that you're participating. You're just
just found out you're in the Hunger Games.
Basically.
That being said, I think from a narrative perspective, like mechanically, like mixing mechanics and narrative, I think is this game's strong point. Is that you're going in with a vibe and you're using that vibe to dictate narrative and to dictate mechanics. So like, because your character is built off of just pretty much what's in their backpack, you kind of get to decide like, okay, maybe like I'll make my own table of like weird oddities that they get to roll from, and I can have them like have these weird oddities and they find out, oh no, those weird oddities are part of a puzzle that they have to put together. And there's a lot of opportunity here. I feel like you have to be the kind of DM that likes that kind of opportunity.
Right. That enjoys that. When it comes to asymmetry, it does seem like the bulk of the work falls on the GM shoulders in terms of the game itself.
100%.
So they're like, yes, we taught, they always, there's that running joke about GMs that over prep, and then you have games like this where if you don't,
there's no game.
There is no game. There's no game, Neo. Or if you're not really a really strong improver, you kind of end up a creek without a paddle because there's literally very little to nothing to work off of,
Unless your DM really wants to throw you into like a combat scenario after combat scenario kind of dungeon crawl. I feel like as somebody who like, if somebody was not a narrative role player or like somebody who liked to role play, this game might be hard for them.
Yeah.
Actually, go ahead.
I was going to say, even in that scenario of it's a combat scenario, this game is a terrible war game.
You're gonna die. They do say you're going to die, like right at the beginning of the book.
Well, it's not the case of like you're going to die. It's just you're given so little. You don't really have in my opinion, a good war game has levers to pull. It has buttons to press. It's, Icon is a pretty good war game because it gives you a lot of stuff and makes combat interesting with a lot of good. I know how this ability works. How can I apply this ability in interesting ways? Where in this game, you don't have inputs. You have, well, I'm going to ask the GM if I can do this, and I'm going to hope that they say yes. And if they don't,
Oh my. Like it just all goes up in smoke. Okay. And I know that there's a lot of people that I know personally that there's a lot of people that love Cairn. They really enjoy narrative focused games, and I was just like, oh no.
I would love to play this game. This kind of game is like right up my alley of like where you're put into a room and told to do improv and they just leave. Yes. And like that's very much my thing, but I can see how like there are definitely people I play with who would be like, I don't want this.
Yeah, it's like, no, thank you.
It's a car with no wheels.
You have to build them as you go. Given the feedback on Cairn, are there any other interesting points points of note that you guys like to add about Cairn before we essentially figure out where it falls on our Weal or Woe scale?
Well, unfortunately, Vixie, I would love to give you some thoughts on Cairn. Unfortunately, the game doesn't give me enough to actually work with to have more of an opinion.
Ooh.
To quote Mitch from the Weal or Woe sci-fi episode, this is giving me a single Dorito chip and I want dinner. Yeah. Kayla, what were you gonna say?
They make you like there's a rolling chart where you roll essentially like what you look like and what you're like as a person, and like I just rolled like the ugliest mofo I could. I am soft and scrawny and my face is broken and my hair is ratty, and it's just like, what?
It's like, okay,
my speech is like husky. I guess that could be good, I guess.
Yeah.
My clothing was bloody. Everything I wear is bloody.
So you're a zombie.
Yeah, I'm essentially just a walking zombie. Yeah, and then I rolled my age, and I rolled 2 nat 20s, which never happens, so I'm 50. 50-year-old.
Oh my god, that's hilarious.
Much like this game, you are a dead person walking.
Yeah.
Oh my god. I can see the editing now. Just gonna put a Lich King on there, and or Vecna. Anyway, so yeah, so that said, now that we've got all that out in the open about Cairn, what are we going to give this game? Weal, woe, or mixed results?
Ugh, this is hard.
Oh, I know.
I will give you a verdict on this game when I have read a game.
That's a cop out. I still need something.
I think that tells you what my verdict on the game is.
So that's a woe from Winter. It's a single Dorito chip. You're supposed to, be able to tell with one. Anyway,
I might go Weal simply because I feel like this would be a fun game to like whip out at the bar and just have everybody scribble out a character, and then we just do some fun little role play. But again, that is not your traditional tabletop setting. Mm-hmm. So I would say I have to be more decisive. I'm going to say woe. I said Weal, but I'm going to say woe.
You're going to change that to woe.
Yes.
Wow. So that's a majority verdict of woe. I kind of do think that this game falls into that category with games like 10 Candles or other games. Which one is the one where it's a Jenga? It's a horror game, but it uses a Jenga tower.
Dread.
Yes. Dread. Or Dread, where they're not laid out for a long form tabletop game. They really are meant for more of a short form. Let's have some pizza and a beer, get a little drunk, and pull out something to just entertain ourselves with for the next couple of hours. But it's not anything that I would say lends itself to really, if you're really into TTRPGs and want to play a TTRPG, this is probably not the best game. It might be, I would also venture to say that this game might be a good way to introduce people to the idea of like rolling dice and playing a character as a soft start. But again, not something that you want for like a long form campaign or for experienced players, because it just won't be interesting. Or like even that it might not be as interesting to them or appeal as much. But then again, I know a lot of people that love Cairn, love playing Cairn. They love bringing it to gatherings to play. So they may see it in a different, like with a different perspective or a different kind of concept in their minds that maybe we don't see, or that just from our look at the game. And that's okay. This is just our personal opinion. So yes, that is our rating for Cairn. And the last game on the list, very interesting game by the name of 13th Age. So 13th Age is another D&D adjacent game. And it is, what's interesting about it is actually, this is probably why I got it confused earlier, is that there are icons in this game that you can choose to follow that kind of lay out your narrative. But yeah, that said, a little bit about 13th Age. I'm going to put where you can find these games, by the way, at the bottom of our little bar. So feel free to look them up and check them out. If you would like. But going back to 13th Age, 13th Age is one of those games that I think was very interesting to kind of look at, especially for a D&D adjacent system. But let's talk about it a little bit more. What did you guys think about the game and its narrative and premise and all of those good things, the world in which 13th Age is set?
So 13th Age is very much a modern D&D game as opposed to Cairn's old school D&D game. Mm-hmm. It is very much based on the more what we understand of classic heroic fantasy elements of your characters are brave heroes going off and vanquishing evil, and you have wizards and fighters and rogues, and it is really just almost this like archetypal D&D experience in a setting. And like Vixie was mentioning earlier with the icons are these specific powerful NPCs that exist in the world and shape the setting that you as a player are expected to engage with and interact with, either positively or negatively, but you cannot ignore them. And that gives the game and the world really good structure to play in. That when you make your character, oh, my character thinks X about this icon. Well, that's a plot hook. And it is structured without being super restrictive. Whereas Icon very much had like its own very specific setting that was, I don't want to say alien, but was very non-traditional in the fantasy TTRPG space. This one is the opposite and has a lot of signposts and things that are very common to what is expected, but open enough that you can still put your spin on it.
And I was gonna say, it sounds like the game itself is going to be a really nice marriage between the player and the DM in terms of narrative, because in building your character, you're going to end up creating plot hooks that the DM can then turn around and use, which I think is to me, I really enjoy collaborative storytelling, and that very much screams collaboration to me. It becomes a collaborative endeavor, which is something that I really like in the TTRPGs that I like to play. But that said, Katelyn, how do you feel about the world and the premise?
I really like this premise. I am always a sucker for like the gods in a D&D world or the higher powers being directly involved with people. I think warlocks, paladins, clerics should get more one-on-one time with their patrons. That's just me. And this is a game that kind of does that. It does say like specifically that you may not be addressing the icon directly. You may be working with like their high priest or their king or something like that they've put in power. But the concept that you have relationships with these higher beings, and the relationships are woven into the plot, and you can have a bad relationship with people. Like you can be like, oh, me and the three-headed dragon god, no, we do not get along.
Can't go there. Bad time.
Have effects on gameplay, and I think that's just really cool. I think similar to what Winter was saying, it's a lot of like what you'd expect out the can for a fantasy adventure, with just enough spice and like something special to it that I think makes it exciting. I mean, it's gonna have like your basic D&D races, classes, stuff like that, but it kind of brought me back a lot more to Pathfinder, of like the level of like customization you get to do with your character between
nice.
And picking your icon relations and your different your powers that you get to get, your spells that exist. The setting for this game is more just like general fantasy, but I think the icons are the big thing that's different, and they do a great job. I think I love this like idea of like here's 10 people that control the entire world.
Yes. And you know what, though? I do love that concept, again, because of I think I've said this before, I really enjoy quick onboarding, quick builds, quick ways to put a story together. And this seems like it would go really fast. The moment your players have characters, suddenly you're hit with a bevy of plot hooks that you can just pull and build a story from, which I think is really, really nice. But anyway, so yeah, as far as the world that we're in, aside from the big icons, is there anything else that you guys think really stands out about this game, or is it just mostly traditional fare aside from this one big thing?
I think for the setting, not too much, honestly.
No,
it's pretty fantasy. There are dragons, there are wizards, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I would even go so far to say that the icons existing in the setting isn't even so much a special thing about the setting, but it's how it uses this bit of a setting to craft that has mechanical relevance to blend the narrative and the mechanics together, which I think we can probably is a good point to seg into.
Yeah, I was gonna say because there is something that I would love to talk about in character creation that I think is unique. It's not like super unique, it's not new, but I think it is unique in the sense that I don't see it used in that many games of this nature. But yeah, so we're gonna talk about game mechanics. Let's talk about game mechanics. I do have a little familiarity with 13th Age, which is why I'm participating a little bit more, but either way, let's go ahead and start with you guys first. As far as game mechanics and game setup go, how did you feel about that? Let's start with character creation.
Character creation, I feel like, resembled a lot of what you kind of get out of the 5e experience of the first couple chapters of the book is here's how you make a character, and it walks you through each step. And I imagine if you have the book physically, it's a lot of flipping between pages. But they do a very good job of kind of just breaking it down really simply. Here are the different like scores you get based on what race you choose, based on what class you choose. And then once you actually get to your class, they kind of walk you through. Like I decided to pick a sorcerer just because I was like, oh, I'm going to practice making a sorcerer. And that I feel like making a spellcaster when you're new to a game can be a big hurdle, but I felt like this was pretty simple.
Nice. Okay. And then Winter, what do you feel about the character creation in 13th Age?
So my favorite bit about the character creation is how I mentioned how the game kind of links its narrative and its mechanics really well, is as an aspect of making a character, you write something that is your unique thing.
That's the bit that I wanted to talk about too, because I love that.
Go ahead, why don't you talk about it?
Yeah. No, you were gonna do the mechanical breakdown. I was just gonna give add I'll just build on that. Don't worry.
Oh, okay, yeah. So your one unique thing lets you as a player have agency over the setting that you're playing in. So if your one unique thing is something like you are the one who learned shadow magic, like that can be a unique thing. And that means that, shadow magic is real in the world. You are the only one who knows how it works. And that gives you as the player a way to work the GM to sculpt a story about how does this thing function.
Yes. I will say, as the other interesting thing about a unique thing, and this is just because I know we have a lot of like power gamers that sometimes will jump in and be like, I can optimize my character further with this ability. One of the things 13th Age tells you to do is not that. Your unique thing is something that needs to be unique to your character. You're the only one you can do it, but it doesn't have to have a mechanical aspect. It can just be something like, let's say you happen to know the recipe for a specific dye color and you can make it and it's like ultra rare and very hard to find. That could be a thing, and that still creates a narrative for the DM to play with, but it's not necessarily something that adds to your character mechanically. Like, what are you going to do with this weird dye recipe? You know what I mean? In terms of like a fight or something. But at the same time, it can still make the narrative very interesting. Like if there's a king that's searching for the specific color. What do you think, Winter?
I mean, basically exactly what Katelyn said. It's you cannot make your character in a vacuum in this game. Your character is explicitly in a conversation with the game and the story you're going to tell. Like you make a unique thing that now has an effect on the world. You write your backgrounds; those have an effect on the world. Even a lot of powers that you can take as just making your character have things that explicitly require and encourage you to be in conversation with your GM. Like one of the wizard feats you can take is wizards have cantrips in this game similar to 5e. One of the feats you can take is you can cast cantrip versions of your full spells, and you are expected to work with a GM to figure out what that looks like. So like if you have Fireball and you have that feat, you can be like, okay, I want to cast a cantrip version of Fireball. Yeah, and like it doesn't have any combat capabilities because cantrips are more utility, but it could, but GM could be like, okay, cool, now your Fireball cantrip, it's like a big road flare, so now people can come find you, or maybe you can use it to like knock down this door with just like a poof of explosion, but like it's not going to actually deal damage, or just like a big light effect and it's like lights up a room, and there's multiple abilities across all characters that have things that are really explicitly encouraged to be in conversation with your GM, while at the same time the game actively giving the GM tools to actually make consistent decisions that are fair and work with the world. You're not, as a GM, you're not expected to just make up all of this on the fly or make up a bunch of rules. There are enough rules. You have a framework. It's like Icon, where the game gives you a lot to work with, and you get to play with it.
Yeah. So there's a good solid framework that you can build off of and kind of make, essentially, like, you have context clues. So if you need to do something that's not necessarily in the book, you have a way to do it that makes sense for the game, which is always appreciated, for sure. So yeah, those are the game mechanics and the game itself as far as world and lore and all those good things. Are there any other points of interest, points of note, anything that you want to talk about when it comes to this game? Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Classic conceits, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a little dated. So it's people who want to play this game should keep that in mind. You may want to tweak that part of the game. Yeah, like, oh yeah, that's like stuff like that. It's very easy. Just, make sure that you are aware of this. Make sure that you talk with your players about it and communicate that across the board so that you can create a safe and happy table for everyone to play in. But yeah, Winter, what are your final thoughts on this game?
Yeah. So on the whole, I love this game. It's really good. This is the D&D that I want D&D to be, but it is not D&D, and that makes it better. However, there is one sticking thing, is that classes are very much not created equally, and it was really made with a design intention of there are simple classes and there are complicated classes. But as anyone who is like really into game design and gameplay knows, the complicated stuff are the good ones, and the simple ones are simple, so you just don't have the same options as the complicated ones, and more options is more good.
Right. And it's almost like the simple ones are good for like beginners. You start there and then you work your way up to like the more complex stuff.
And that is definitely the intention, but it can lead to awkward feels at a table where it's like, well, the barbarian has stuff it can do and it's neat, but it is vastly overshadowed by the complexity and the utility that like a wizard can do. And while it is intentional design and I can appreciate it, it can lead to some awkward feelings at the game table.
That's true.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I would almost argue that doing a simplicity complexity like split is ultimately worse for a game, because it can wind up in a situation where people at the table are playing fundamentally different games. Like if you want to, like, every class should have an equal level of complexity and options, because you can't really have less complexity without negating options.
Right. And again, also, it's funny because I've had this argument specifically about D&D before, and if it sounds like we're talking about D&D a lot, we are in Wheel of Woe Fantasy, and it is the largest fantasy freaking TTRPG out there, in case you've been living under a rock since the 70s. Anyway, so, and that's kind of the thing with 13th Age that's kind of coming across as interesting. And this is an argument that I have about D&D too, where a lot of people tend to lean towards the caster classes because they're considered more powerful, or like they have more in a battle or an optimization sense. And then you have like the martial classes, which are seen as somehow not being as powerful by virtue of them not innately knowing some form of magic necessarily, unless you're like in a subclass where that has that. But even then, it's like, what if you're just a fighter? What if you played a regular old fighter who's maybe a battle master? How do you leverage that with like a wizard, for example, who has a ton of spells at their disposal, et cetera, et cetera? And I mean, in D&D, they do it in the sense of the fighter is very much a tankier kind of character. They have higher HP. They have like, they're tactically designed to complement each other, where the wizard is soft and fluffy and could potentially die. Here's my shield. It's one turn. It's gone. There goes my reaction. Fuck. But it's very interesting to me, because even that, like, you do have that balance within D&D, but I don't think that's perfect either. Especially, so it's just an argument that I often have, and I think that 13th Age and the simplicity and the complexity classes kind of makes that even more apparent in that way. So if that makes sense. I don't know if what I said makes sense.
It makes sense. I I will say I think your statement about D&D balance is incorrect, but the spirit of your message is received and incorrect.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I know that D&D is not balanced, it's not perfect, but that's real. It's kind of, I just think that I guess when I was saying is the methodology behind that, that's probably the logic that went into that. I definitely don't think it's perfect, and I don't think that negates the difference in them at all.
No.
It's just an example to illustrate like this is what they did, but this system doesn't even have that.
Yeah.
There's nothing that says here's why you should play a fighter versus a wizard. It's just like a wizard is all powerful and a fighter just has a sword.
Hallelujah.
Your fighter's a red shirt. That's great. Where's the appeal? You know? Exactly. The sword's enchanted now. It's sentient.
I'm not saying that my fantasy heartbreaker game is just making fighters into JoJo characters, but I think this is how you do it, and I think that's cool and good, actually.
Okay.
Anyway.
That's the next TTRPG. We find ourselves in JoJo TTRPG and just do JoJo memes all day.
I'm sure you can find one.
There is probably one on itch right now somewhere just waiting to be discovered. But anyway, all right, so that is a little bit of the mechanic side, or final thoughts and feelings on the game. So on a scale of Weal to Woe, what would you guys give this game? Don't all go at once. Okay, great. So it's a good game. Right up here. Okay, great. So Weal from Katelyn. What do you think, Winter?
Oh, it's absolutely a Weal. It is that it's not perfect, obviously, but it is, if you want a modern D&D experience without playing D&D and being beholden to Wizards of the Coast and all of that fun stuff, 13th Age is a amazing replacement for D&D. It's the same feel, it's the same type, it comes from the same place, but it has enough interesting stuff to break the monotony of D&D 5e.
I agree. I think that's the vibe I'm getting too. It's, again, like you said, Winter, it's a great D&D alternative if you're trying to maybe explore what's out there aside from D&D. If you want to try something that's not D&D, if you're a first-time GM, or if you have friends that have never played TTRPGs before, this game sort of gives you that classic. The classic idea of what a TTRPG is believed to be. A lot of that original idea was from Dungeons and Dragons and Shadowrun and all of these games that started us off. It gives you that feel, but makes it a lot more palatable and a lot easier and accessible to play. Whereas those games were really not meant for the people that we are today, I would say, and have been, like, a lot of people have gone out of their way to adapt it for who we are today, but this game does a really good job of kind of making it open and accessible and getting you started within this world of fantasy TTRPGs without necessarily overcomplicating it or being so overwhelming that you just kind of drop it and go, no thanks. But so that said, I think with Weals from both parties, the general consensus is a Weal, which means since this is a game that got a Weal, I think that makes it our Barkeep's choice. Are we saying, is that what we're gonna say? All right, great. So our Barkeep's choice for this episode is 13th Age. I am so excited to play this. Actually, it's funny. I was reading it, and it gave me the formatting is very reminiscent of other games that I've played, but that are also D&D adjacent. There's a specific module called Valda's Spire of Secrets that's very similar. Granted, they subvert a lot of classes. If you have an opportunity to look it up, I advise you to check it out. It's been kickstarted, and I believe it is available. I should have the links in the bottom bar there for you to check out. Also very fun. Check out those classes in there as well. I love they have like a class called a party paladin, where you're basically just a frat bro, which is great.
Yo,
yes,
the dream,
right, the dream, living the dream. Another fun one is the martyr, and essentially you can't die until the universe says you can, which is really fun. But they have little classes like that, which are very fun. And 13th Age kind of, again, it's not the same, but it's just similar in its setup. And where Baldus does the classes, 13th Age just kind of gives you the overall experience of being at the table and rolling some dice and creating some characters and writing a fun story, while making it like light and easy for everyone to follow. So yeah, I am excited again to play this game. For once, I will not be DMing it. I've been doing a lot lately, okay? So I'm going to take a break from that. The wonderful Winter will be GMing this game. So we're gonna see what mischief Winter gets us into. This is gonna be my first time with Winter as a GM. So I don't know if I should be terrified.
Realm.
Should we be scared?
There's no escape.
Maybe we should have stuck with Cairn.
So I don't have to run anything? Okay, cool.
Maybe that Dorito chip was looking good. Anyway, so tune in next week for our episode of Weal or Woe, in which we test play 13th Age and show you a little bit about what this game is all about and why we like it so much. Thank you so much for watching Weal or Woe today. I appreciate it. Make sure you follow the Pocket Dragon on all socials. And Winter and Katelyn, why don't we tell the audience where they can find you as well? Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you.
You can find me at my website, heykatelyn.com. And I do graphic design work for the tabletop industry, and I'm always looking for fun projects to work on. You can also find me on Twitter at heykatelyn_s. And yeah, I'm always happy to talk about games.
Yay! I know a bunch of indie TTRPG makers that would love to find you. So
I would love to work on those projects.
I'll let them know.
I am one of them. Hi, I'm an indie TTRPG maker.
So many. Let's go.
So you cannot find me personally anywhere on social media. However, you can find the team I work with, Cybernetic Coven. We're an international artist collective that does have a interest in tabletop role-playing games. You can find our work at cyberneticcoven.com, as well as on Twitter at cybercovenart.
Exciting. And that is where you can find our wonderful guest, Barkeeps. As always, I am your friendly neighborhood GM and player here at the Pocket Dragon Pub, Vixie Bell. Once again, make sure you follow us on all social medias. If you missed today's episode, then you might be watching us on YouTube during our replay. And yeah, we'll see. We hope you enjoyed this review, and we hope we've given you a little bit an amuse-bouche of different games you can try with your friends at your home. Anyway, we'll see you soon. Have a great night.